Absolute idealism is the doctrine that reality is ideal or spiritual, and that there are not many such independent realities. There is only one all-inclusive reality, which, being dependent on nothing else, there being nothing outside it, can be said to be independent, irrelative, or absolute. We know how Hegel came to hold absolute idealism. We shall discuss now how the different Hegelians arrive at this conclusion. The arguments used are many, and all lines of argument do not wholly converge. Consequently, we have slightly different conceptions of the absolute. But the different formulations of absolute idealism are all attempts, conscious or unconscious, at reaching Hegel's conclusion from different points of departure consistently with modern currents of thought. There has been an attempt to classify different modern arguments for idealism under three heads. A. The epistemological argument. B. The argument from the contingent nature of objects of experience. C. The ontological argument. This classification is neither exhaustive nor wholly inclusive. A more convenient classification, which we shall adopt here, is to bring the arguments under two classes, epistemological and non-epistemological. We must remember, however, that the two are scarcely found in isolated forms in any individual thinker. 1. The epistemological argument. This argument is based on considerations regarding the nature of knowledge. In history, we have an instance of this in the gradual elimination of the not-self through the epistemological doctrines of Kant, Fichte, and Hegel. Reverses of materialism, which began in Kant's epistemology, were carried to logical completion by his successors. Berkeley also bases his idealism on an empirical analysis of knowledge. Among modern idealists, we find the epistemological argument in Green. We have already seen how Green discovers the existence of a spiritual principle as the necessary presupposition of human knowledge, and how he shows that for the possibility of knowledge, it is necessary that this principle should be considered identical with the one underlying the world of nature, and how he comes thus to establish an eternal, all-inclusive consciousness, of which self and nature are different correlative aspects. We have here, then, an instance of absolute idealism reached chiefly through epistemological considerations. Another argument cited, as an instance of this epistemological argument for absolute idealism, we have also, in an earlier British thinker, J.F. Ferrier, 1808 to 1864, who uses it in his Institutes of Metaphysics. His argument proceeds in a geometrical form. It has been briefly summed up thus. That which truly and absolutely exists is either that which we know, or that which we are ignorant of, or that which we neither know nor are ignorant of. And no other alternative is possible. But that which we neither know nor are ignorant of must be the contradictory. For if it were not the contradictory, it would be knowable, and, therefore, either an object of knowledge or an object of ignorance. That which truly and absolutely exists is not the contradictory, however, since there is no contradiction involved in the proposition that something, whatever it may be, truly and absolutely exists. Consequently, that which exists must be either an object of knowledge or an object of ignorance. That is, it can be neither matter per se nor ego per se, but only some object plus some subject. Any absolute existent, then, is, necessarily, mind together with that which it apprehends. Ferrier thus proves that what is real must be a mind in synthesis with objects. But how many such reals are there, one or many? Following the law of parsimony, He asserts that as only one such mind is sufficient to explain everything, only one is logically necessary. He thus feels certain of the existence of one absolute mind, having all things for its objects. The supposition of many finite reals, i.e., finite minds in connection with its limited objects, is redundant. Ferrier concludes, therefore, that, quote, there is one, but only one, absolute experience, which is strictly necessary, and that existence is a supreme and infinite and everlasting mind in synthesis with all things, end quote. The epistemological argument of absolute idealists like Green and Ferrier differs from that of subjective idealists like Berkeley, in this that while the latter tried to prove by it the existence of mind as subject, as the only independent substance, the former tried to prove the existence of a mind in which the subject and the object are inseparably correlated aspects. Another kind of epistemological argument, often found in Hegelian writings, is based on the knowledge of the finite, the imperfect, the conditioned, etc. It is pointed out that such knowledge presupposes a subject which is distinct from these and therefore capable of knowing these as such. The very knowledge, for example, of the finite as finite, it is argued, implies that the knower is capable of transcending the finite. It implies an implicit feeling of being infinite. This argument thus reinforces the belief in an infinite and similarly perfect, unconditioned mind. No finite, therefore, can be said to be self-existent or self-contained, or to have independent existence. If reality means self-existence, no finite can be real. Again, if reality must be free from self-contradiction, the only thing that can possess reality is the whole, including all finites. This whole is not a mere aggregate. Since every finite is related to and determined by every other finite, the parts of this whole are inseparably related and mutually determined. The whole is then a genuine organic whole, the whole being all-inclusive. Reality is identical with this whole and must be one. There being nothing but the whole, the existence of the whole is not determined by anything outside of it. It is not therefore relative, but absolute. Thus, the reality of one absolute, in which all finites are interrelated as parts, is forced on us. Applying to this conclusion the theory stated before that a system of many interrelated members, in which there is unity of the manifold, implies a self-conscious mind which unifies it as an object, we reach the doctrine of absolute idealism, or the doctrine that there is the absolute mind of which all finite things are objects, and in which they are unified into a system. What is proved in the above argument is also sometimes reached in a slightly different way. Starting from the Leibnizian assumption that reality must be self-determined, that, quote, nothing really exists, which is not self-determined and self-related, end quote, it is shown that no particular finite object can be said to be self-determined, and no such object can, therefore, be real. The only self-determined entity is the whole system containing all finites, that in which all finite objects stand in relation. This system being a unity of the manifold can be nothing but a self-conscious being. From an argument like this, Caird concludes, quote, so soon as we are driven to recognize that reality can be found in that and only that which has a principle of self-determination in itself, we seem forced to recognize that the only reality is God, end quote. Bernard Bosanquet's argument for the absolute belongs to this general class, as the name a contingentia mundi, which he gives to it, most certainly shows. But his formulation of the argument has some novelty worth mentioning. He points out that if we reflect, we find that all our experiences, whether they be cognitive, aesthetic, moral, etc., which are fragmentary, incomplete, and incoherent, always tend to become more and more complete and coherent. Every finite experience is opposed by something else, and there is a constant tendency of the finite to expand itself, include its other, overcome opposition. This inward tendency shows that the whole of our being points toward a perfect experience in which all opposition is to be overcome by the harmonious absorption of everything. This inclusive whole of experience may be called the Absolute. Quote, "This, then, is the fundamental nature of the inference to Absolute. The passage from the contradictory and unstable in all experience alike to the stable and satisfactory." End quote. The tendency towards completion by overcoming contradiction is, quote, "the positive and constructive principle of non-contradiction." In other words, the spirit of the whole, and is the operative principle of life as of metaphysical thought. End quote. The spirit is the underlying principle in logic, understood as it was by Plato and Hegel, the supreme law or nature of experience, the impulse towards unity and coherence, the positive spirit of non-contradiction, by which every fragment yearns toward the whole to which it belongs, and every self to its completion in the Absolute, and of which the Absolute itself is at once an incarnation and a satisfaction. Every idealist metaphysic bases its argument on this spirit of the whole, and such an argument in general may be described as an argument a contingentia mundi, i.e., from fragmentary and contingent natures of finite experience as the starting point to the all-inclusive and coherent whole. The Absolute, thus inferred, is best conceived in terms of our spirit, insofar as different fragmentary experiences are in it knit together into a coherent individual. But the finite self is never a fully complete and coherent system. It has unresolved conflicts. It is still on the way to completion. The Absolute is the perfect, self-complete, and fully coherent individual, as the concrete, all-inclusive synthesis of every conceivable thing and thought. It is the concrete universal. The conception of the concrete universal has been developed elaborately by Bosanquet, and it has come to occupy a very important place in his philosophy. He contrasts the concrete universal to the abstract universal, which is attained by generalization from particulars by omitting their individual particularities. Quote, "The generality is framed attending to the common qualities of a number of individuals, and disregarding their differences." End quote. Such an abstract universal is pure identity without diversity. There is no synthesis, no harmony, no coherence in it, as it is empty of contents. Such a false abstraction cannot be the nature of the Absolute. The Absolute, being the all-inclusive, harmonious synthesis of all particulars, cannot be conceived after such an abstract universal. The key to the conception of the Absolute can be found in the idea of an individual, like Socrates, who unifies diverse aspects and states into one inclusive whole. Such a universal, which contains and unifies the many into one without omitting or effacing their multiplicity, is called by Bosanquet the true or the concrete universal. As he puts it, quote, "A diversity recognized as a unity, a macrocosm constituted by microcosms, is the type of the concrete universal." End quote. The Absolute, according to Bosanquet, is, therefore, a concrete universal, a perfect individual. This conception is an elaboration of Bradley's idea of the Absolute. Josiah Royce, the leading American idealist, also argues, in his Gifford lectures entitled The World and the Individual, like Bosanquet, to show that the self-transcending implications of our finite experience point to an absolute being, a self-complete individual life or experience. His dynamic and teleological conception of the human mind and the absolute being imparts, however, a new turn to his argument, as well as to the movement of absolute idealism. Therefore, his views deserve special consideration. Royce shares with his great pragmatist colleague, William James, the voluntaristic outlook. He also follows Plato and Kant in thinking that human knowledge develops by the materialization or external application of ideas. The ideas that our mind inwardly entertains seek materialization in sense experience. The ideas by themselves are abstract and universal, and they strive to become real through concrete and individual sense experience. If we study the purpose and tendency of our mental life, we should not fail to notice that the mind is not satisfied with vague, indeterminate, abstract ideas. It always craves for concrete, determinate, individual reality. Perception, or sense experience, is the process by which the mind constructs by selection external objects for the concrete realization of its inner ideas. Quote, "Every idea is as much a volitional process as it is an intellectual process," end quote. If we examine an idea, we find that the purpose that moves this act of will is that of self-realization in concrete experience. This purpose can, therefore, be regarded as the internal meaning of the idea. A concrete external object of perception in which the idea seeks self-fulfillment can be said to be the external meaning of the idea. The external is only the embodiment of the internal and not alien to it. Realists, who think of the object as existing independently of mental activity, fail to explain how the two independent entities, the idea and the object, can come to fit in and correspond with each other so marvelously without a miracle. Analysis of perception shows that it is through and through a selective purposive activity of the mind. What object will be perceived at a particular time will depend on the idea, the selecting activity of the perceiver. Sense experience is not, quote, "whatever happens to come to hand." It is carefully and attentively selected experience, end quote. The so-called stubborn empirical facts are really the products of mind's purposive selection in light of its ideas. Man thinks in order to get control of his world, and thereby of himself. The external experience which he has is what he selects in accordance with his needs and cravings. If we critically examine the correspondence theory of truth held by most realists, we also find out the error of realism. Truth is not really attained by the mind's copying or resembling a pre-existing independent object. For in that case, most of what is accepted as true would cease to be so. A true idea of a dog need not itself bark in order to be true. Truth does not necessarily depend upon any objective resemblance or correspondence between ideas and facts, but it depends on the fulfillment of mind's intention or purpose. What kind and degree of relation between ideas and objects will be taken as necessary for a true representation of facts will depend upon the mind which chooses such representation. Truth is thus found to be determined by the purposive, selective activity of the mind. This again points to the fact that true knowledge is mind's successful selection and construction of objects for the realization of its ideas, and not mind's representation of already existing objects. Now, in the light of this theory of knowledge, Royce tries to find out the implications of human experience. We've seen that our inner life of ideas is constantly craving for becoming more real by being more concrete and more determinate through sense experience. But this craving is not fully satisfied by the perceived objects which collectively constitute my world. For even this world of external objects cannot be accepted by me as the final fulfillment of the mind's quest for the concrete and the individual reality. I have the idea of a substance in the mind. It is general, vague, and abstract, as compared with a particular substance, say a man that I perceive as the outer embodiment of the idea. Therefore, I say that the perceived substance is more real than the mere idea of it. But even the perceived substance, man, is not completely determinate and concrete, because on seeing it, I feel that this is the only one of those innumerable perceptions of substance I could possibly have. Similarly, my perceived world, as a whole, also leaves me to think that this is not the only way in which the ideas, of which it is the external fulfillment, could be realized, and that other perceivers might have quite other kinds of worlds in fulfillment of similar ideas. Owing to this lingering uncertainty and want of complete determination, I cannot accept the world of perception as the only and ultimate reality. The ultimate reality, of which I have an idea, is understood by me as that about which there can be no doubt whether it is of this nature or of another nature. A table or a chair perceived by me always leaves room, however, for the doubt as to whether it is perceived to be the same by all others, or whether tables and chairs may not be of other kinds. Therefore, the perceived world of mine cannot be accepted by me as the only and full realization of my ideas. Perception is quest for reality, but it fails to attain complete reality. But this failure is not without its lesson, for it teaches us that what is real must not merely be an idea, general and vague, but a concrete and determinate embodiment of the idea in immediate experience. Moreover, to be ultimately real, this reality sought by the ideas must be the complete fulfillment or embodiment of all ideas, admitting of no other alternatives. It can be concluded, therefore, that the ultimate reality which our thought seeks can be nothing other than the absolute, which is the complete realization of immediate experience of all ideas in all possible ways. It follows that there cannot be such an absolute and ultimate reality without an absolute experience. This experience must include all finite experience, but achieve what they fail completely to attain by overcoming their shortcomings. This concrete experience can be said to be the perfect individual, because, like an individual, it claims uniqueness. It allows no alternative, since it is all-inclusive. In view of the dynamic nature of experience, this absolute is described by Royce in contrast with the intellectualist Hegelians as follows. Quote, a will concretely embodied in a life, and these meanings, identical with the very purposes that our poor fleeting finite ideas are even now so fragmentarily seeking, amidst all their flickerings and their conflicts, to express. This alone is. All else is either shadow, or else is partial embodiment, i.e., is a striving after that ideal, which needs for its own expression this very striving. End quote. Thus, the examination of the meaning of finite experience leads us to absolute experience. By admitting this all-inclusive absolute as the organized system of all finite ideas, objects, and experiences, and by admitting these latter as its fragments, we can understand better the possibility of agreement between ideas and objects, and better the experience of one person and that of another. And we can also better explain the meaning of the one absolute reality which science wants to know, as well as the meaning of consensus of scientific opinion. Royce sums up in another work the argument for the absolute in the following way, quote, there is for us, as we are, experience. Our thought undertakes the interpretation of this experience. Every intelligent interpretation of an experience involves, however, the appeal from this experienced fragment to some more organized whole of experience, in whose unity this fragment is conceived as finding its organic place. To talk of any reality which this fragmentary reality indicates is to conceive this reality as the content of the more organized experience. To assert that there is any absolutely real fact indicated by our experience is to regard this reality as presented to an absolutely organized experience, in which every fragment finds its place." End quote. This absolute of philosophy is, for Royce, the god of religion. The dynamic conception of mind as will enables us to conceive the absolute as creator of the world, all finite wills being regarded as the fragments of one will. The inclusion of all experience and reality makes the absolute omniscient and all-powerful. The fulfillment of all finite wants in absolute experience make it perfect. And the overcoming of all evils make it all good. As a self-conscious individual, the absolute is a person. Royce's philosophy thus provides also a rational justification for the popular beliefs about God.